Hello, and welcome to Productivity in Prose, a podcast about making the most of your writing time and honing your craft. Whether you're a seasoned author or a new writer, this podcast offers helpful tips to maximize your writing time, increase your writing productivity, and tackle the sometimes tough aspects of the writer life. I'm your host, Emily, author of Suspended in the Stars, among other things, and today's topic is how to figure out your capacity as a writer. I began my love of writing when I was young. My best friend, who is still my best friend after all these years, and I would exchange notebooks of stories. We'd each write a page or so and then hand it over to see what the next person wrote. But it was more than that. We also spent countless hours creating worlds for our Barbies to live in. So much so that we'd plan out the entire backstory, and then by the time we were ready to play, we'd be bored, and we'd move on to the next thing like dress up or something. I think this shows that what we loved and what most love about writing was a solid story. The experience told us something or showed us the promise of change for the character or Barbie and created within us this sense of wonder and excitement about what could be. I wanted to start off this episode about capacity with this story because, as I mentioned in episode 4, when we know the why behind our writing, the rest is important, but not the most important. I mentioned the questions we tend to have, like, how many words is too many? And what is a healthy writing goal? But those goals have to start from a heart that's focused on the priorities of your writing before breaking it down into the hard numbers. Let's start by identifying what I mean by capacity. First off, it's easy to boil this down to word count because that's the most quantifiable factor for a writer. I did a funny reel recently about things that are unique to authors, and one of those things is the fact that we'll often talk about our projects in word count. This makes it hard when people ask, "How's your book coming?" And I reply with, "It's at XYZ number of words done." They give me this blank smile and then follow up with questions like, "What is that in pages?" And as a writer knows, this is a tough question to answer. Are they thinking about a Word document of pages, double-spaced, single, or book pages for, small trade books or large books? As a note here for reference, if you do find yourself getting this question a lot, I tend to use the metric of 250 words per page as a conversion. It's not 100% accurate, but it'll get you close. So a 50,000 word book would be about 200 pages, which is what I find most people want to know. Anyway, there are other things that make up a writer's capacity as well. Things like, how many points of view can I have in a story? How many books, short stories, or novellas can I write in a year? How many books can I launch in a year? I'm sure I'm missing some things, but in addition to word count, those are the things that come to mind right away. Today, I'd like to break down some of these things and give you questions to ask yourself and a task to do in order to uncover your capacity as a writer. Yes, I will mostly focus on word count because that is the easiest metric, but I'll touch on the others as well. And while I probably don't have to say this, I will. Know that you do not have to fit into any of these categories exclusively or even part of the time. You are going to have days, weeks, months, and maybe even years when you may only be able to do one project or even less than that, and that's okay. This episode will be most helpful to those trying to figure out what their capacity is or ways to find that capacity, but also to those who, like me, have been writing for a long time and are potentially published, but they aren't sure that they're working to their fullest capacity or even past it. Let's dive in with how many points of view can I have in a story? Know why I'm starting here? Because it's the easiest to answer, and that is as many as the story needs. Ha! But before I jump into the next point, I will take a second to focus on this because while I don't think there's a right answer to this question, I do think that there are some good and less good ways to handle point of view. I'm currently working on the second book in the Xeris Galaxy saga, Falling Through the Black, and I've found myself juggling over 4 points of view. Yeah, that's a lot when Suspended in the Stars was only 2 points of view. But the nature of a trilogy like this dictates that I need to be able to show different things, and the best way to do that is through alternative points of view. Where I think an author can go wrong, and I don't even want to use that word because I think it's too harsh, but I think they try too hard to show multiple things without realizing the through line of the story. One of my favorite thriller writers is David Baldacci, and he tends to have multiple points of view in his books. Sometimes those even start the book and then that POV character gets killed off. That's one way to do it, but the rest of the book usually tends to follow 3 to 4 points of view. Then there's J.R.R. Martin and his series Game of Thrones, which I have not read yet. And he's got a ton of point of view characters, like a lot from what I've heard people say. So how do you decide what pattern to follow? When I'm deciding how many points of view to add, I ask myself what the story needs. For Falling Through the Black, I've got characters scattered across the galaxy, and there is no cohesive way to keep just 2 points of view, or I would lose part of the story. But for other books I've written, like the romance I'll be starting soon, I tend to do 2 points of view, his and hers. My cozy mysteries only have 1 point of view usually. So some of that is dictated by genre, but you can bend and blur those lines. It's just most importantly decided by what serves the book best. If you find yourself adding multiple points of view and have a hard time keeping track of everything, odds are your readers will as well. But if you have a hard time keeping your story to 1 point of view and want to tell something from another character's perspective, then that's telling as well. As far as capacity goes, I tend to caution newer writers from adding in too many points of view. What can happen is that they will all start to sound the same because a newer author is still trying to establish their writing voice. But also, even for a seasoned author, adding a point of view doesn't mean the book is better. It just means that there's more to keep straight, and the writing has to be that much tighter so that each perspective feels different to the reader. Don't add points of view just to add them. Don't take on more than you need to in order to make your story great. The next question will be the biggest one we tackle today, and that is, how many words can I write in a day, a week, a month, a year? Is it starting to sound like a theme song? Basically, what is my word count capacity? This is all very personal, so I don't think there is a right or wrong, or better or worse, answer to this question. But I do think that there are ways to figure it out. I've mentioned before that I was a ghostwriter for about 10 years. When I first started, I had no idea what the answer to this question was. Honestly, I probably didn't even know that it was a question to have. I just knew that I needed to find more jobs to take on so that I could make a living. I also found myself starting off with smaller jobs that had low word counts. Things like writing Etsy descriptions or scripts for a YouTube channel that dealt with music videos. That was an interesting one. But over time, I realized there was more money in writing longer works, and it was easier for me because it was fiction. I can make stuff up like nobody's business, but when you ask me to write a factual essay, it's going to take more time. So I switched to fiction. Most of the books I was writing at the time were shorter in length, somewhere between 45 to 50,000 words. And a lot of the times, the clients needed the book relatively quickly, like 2 to 3 weeks. That is not my favorite type of turnaround time for something that length, but a girl's gotta eat, so I took on those projects. While I didn't start out this fast, I do remember a few times where I wrote 10,000 words in a day just to make my deadlines. Yeah, ouch, that was not fun, but it taught me something about myself. I can do the hard thing when I am down to the wire. But honestly, the real lesson I've taken away from that in recent years is that I need to figure out my true capacity, not just what I can do under pressure. And yes, those are actually 2 different things. Let me dig into that a little. You have more than one capacity as a creative. You have the kind of capacity that comes when you feel free and things are going well. You have another capacity when you're under a deadline, and yet another capacity when you're burned out or not feeling the project, but you still have to write it. You also have different capacities at different times of the year and depending on what's going on in your life. But Emily, you ask, how can I possibly know my one true capacity if there are so many factors? Well, you can't. I know. Are you wondering if this episode is clickbait? I get it, I really do, but hear me out. Knowing your ideal capacity, as I'm going to call it, will help you establish a working timeline for most projects and will help you work smarter, not harder. I'll use myself in this month as an example. I have done the hard work, which I'll get to in a few minutes, and know my ideal capacity as a writer is about 3,000 words a day. Can I write more than that? For sure. Do I sometimes want to write less than that? Also yes. But I know I can reliably do 3,000 words in a day for several weeks at a time and not feel burned out or overwhelmed. This month, I had a project to finish that I honestly should have finished last year, It was pushed to January, so I was in crunch time. Now, crunch time Emily knows that she needs to do more than 3,000 words a day if she's going to make it to her deadline. I don't like to add on more, but I chose the mindset of focusing on getting this project done so that it would be A, off my plate, and B, so that I could switch to something more fun and get back to that 3,000 a day comfort zone. I actually ended up averaging about 4,600 words a day, though in reality that looked like 4,000 one day, 6,000 another, 3,000 another, etc. And I got the project done in a total of 1 day of plotting and 10 days of writing. Was it fun? Not really. Could I sustain this for the next 5 months? No. But the project is done and I'm happy. Back to the topic. I believe finding that ideal capacity is essential for any writer because it gives you healthy guidelines with which to work by, and it will help you answer our next question. But we're not quite there yet. Remember, my ideal is about 3,000 words a day, 4 or 5 days a week. That's a total of 15,000 words a week if all goes well. Knowing those numbers means I can estimate quite a bit and know roughly when things will be done by. The hard thing here is that we don't live in an ideal world. Life happens. Maybe you have a job you're working as well, or you get sick, or you hit a snag in your plot and have to rework. That's where your ideal is nice but can fly out the window. My suggestion? Find your ideal using what I'll outline next, and then bank in days or weeks to give yourself time for life to happen. Let yourself have a few extra days over and above what you think you'll need, because it's almost a guarantee that something will come up once you've got your beautiful writing plan done and inked in. So how do you find your ideal word count? Practice. No one likes to hear that, but it is true in this case, as it is in many others. When I started ghostwriting, I didn't know how many words I could write in a day. I just set out to write the book. But as I got more clients and deadlines became a thing, I'd see what I needed to write word count-wise for all clients and wonder whether or not I was going to hit that by the deadlines. It was a gamble each day wondering, will I make it? I do not prefer to work that way, and I realized quickly that I needed to break it down even further to a daily word count, and sometimes by client, if I was going to work 2 or more books. Breaking it down that way helped me know that what I was writing each day would get me to the deadlines on time. As I did for myself, I'd like to set you up for success with this exercise to uncover your ideal word count. I suggest giving yourself a solid hour 1 time a day for a week or longer to truly get a good baseline. Make sure you're using a book or a project where you know where you're heading for each of these hour-long sessions. And remember, we're looking for ideal word count here. This is the type of word count that you feel comfortable with, but this comes about by knowing where you're heading in a story and working without distractions. Once you've got your writing direction established, sit down with a timer and break up your writing time into 4 15-minute sprints. Yes, we are sprinting, but don't let that ticking clock give you anxiety. This isn't about your top speed. It's just about an honest look at how much you write in good conditions with the plot ready to go. These 15-minute increments are going to help you break these things down into metrics. I guess you could do it in an hour if you wanted to, but I find that sometimes I need a break, especially if I'm not positive where I'm heading next in the story. Once you've done this for a week or longer, take each of those sprints, add up their word count, divide it by the number of sprints you did, and boom, baby, you've got your ideal word count number. Caveat here, this number is likely to change. If you're an established writer and you're just curious about this number, it could be pretty consistent for you. But if you're a newer writer, it might be a lower number than a seasoned author, and that is totally okay. Just remember to take stock and redo this process if you're finding that you're exceeding your word count with each writing session. As an example, I used to be able to get about 500 to 600 words done in a sprint. That is, if conditions are good and the words are flowing. But I've seen that number bump up significantly in recent years. I've consistently written over 800 words per 15 minutes for a while now. This month alone, I might have done my best sprint yet with a whopping 1,020 words in 15 minutes. Don't be intimidated by that. I've done a lot of fast writing for years, and this tends to happen most on books that are contemporary in nature, which makes it easier for me to write them, honestly. My science fiction and fantasy novels tend to be much slower due to their unique world building. Knowing this lovely ideal word count number then begs the question, how many books, short stories, and novellas can I write in a year? Remember, the numbers you found are estimates based on semi-perfect conditions. That means when you're feeling good, clear-minded, and have a plot to follow, and the stars align, you can write X amount of words in 15 minutes. In order to best decide what your capacity is per book or story, we need to start doing some math. I know, I hate it too, but this is where my trusty word count spreadsheet comes in super handy. I've done a video about this on my Patreon page, but basically, I've set up several Excel spreadsheets to help me track my progress, view potential progress, and plan out my writing year. It's as simple as using math to plot every writing day out, but it's also difficult knowing that things will come up. Another example from my life. If I take 3,000 words as my ideal word count, that means 15,000 words in a week and 60,000 words in a month. That's only if I write every weekday, always get 3,000 words or more, and don't take any weekdays off of writing. It sounds great, 60,000 words a month, woohoo! But I know from experience it's never that easy. I think a better number for me is around 50,000 words a month, but not every month. Again, rest breaks, etc. are really important. Now, take that data from your sprints. For me, let's average 600 words for 15 minutes. I know I can do more than that, probably closer to 700 to 800 words, but I don't want to feel pressure to have to get that every time. I've found that if I plan for 600 words and consistently get 7 to 8, I feel so much better about myself. Is this a psychology trick? I can usually get things done faster than I expected, even though I planned for 600 words every 15 minutes. It also helps to allow for short breaks between sprints and other things like that. Anyways, back to our numbers. If I'm planning on 600 words for 15 minutes, that means I can technically get my 3,000 words written in 5 15-minute sprints. That means in an hour and 15 minutes of writing each day for 5 days a week, I can write 50 to 60,000 words in a month. Taking that information to my handy Excel sheet, I can block off around maybe 17 days a month to write, and I know I can get about 50,000 words done in that time. This helps me to know that if I want to write a 100,000 word book and give myself 2.5 to 3 months, it's plenty of time. But that's only to write the book and not booking in time to edit and reread and other things like that. My capacity as a writer looks like that, but this is not always my output as a writer. As I mentioned before, I'm still trying to find that ultimate sweet spot of how many projects in a year is just right for me. I could do more short stories and novellas in the time that it would take me to write a full book, but that doesn't mean I should. I could also technically write 4 full-length novels in a year, but that doesn't mean that I should. Knowing your capacity as a writer also must take into account the other responsibilities and priorities you have in your life. Set reasonable goals first, and then add things on should the time be made available to you. And a note here. If you're a newer writer, your ideal may look very different than mine, and that is totally okay. Don't pressure yourself to fit into a faster mode than what you're comfortable with and can actually sustain. I can do 3,000 words a day, but I can't do it forever. I need rest breaks, sometimes up to a few weeks or a month in between projects. And I prefer to write my novels in one chunk per novel before taking those breaks. That's preferential, so you'll need to try out different methods to ultimately find what works for you. And lastly, a question for the established author. How many books can I launch in a year? I put this here because sure, I could write 4 100,000 word books in a year, or 8 50,000 word books, which is a lot. And maybe I could even get them all edited, but I don't know that I would love launching that many books, especially not 8 in a year. After launching Suspended in the Stars, I found that it was way more work than I'd expected, but it was also very draining. I much prefer the writing and talking about my book process, but launching, well, that and all the promo associated with it was really tough. Now, I realize there are some authors out there who do not need to do much for their launch. They can just put a book out and voila, it's purchased and reviewed and their fans are happy. But for me, establishing a new pen name in a genre I hadn't published in yet, and also doing it on my own as an independent author, it was not that smooth, though I hope for the day when it can be. We must take into account more than just how many words we can write and how many books that means we can create in a year. We have to consider how much energy we have to put towards those books before, during, and after launch. We've touched on most of the topics I think we as writers need to consider when we're trying to hone in on our capacity as writers, but I want to take a moment to point out a few things that can either hinder or slow down that capacity. As you're planning and finding out your ideal, take some time to consider and watch out for these factors. Rewriting. It may seem obvious, but writing is more than just getting the words down. For me, this process can take weeks or even months depending on the need of the book. It looks like rereading your original draft, making a plan for editing, putting that plan in place, and then doing another reread. Editing. What usually follows rewriting for me is sending it off to my editor. There is a time frame here for them to go through your work and then for you to go through their comments as well. You may need several more rounds of this just to get the book polished. Plot issues. These are the lovely little things that come up when your plot, if you have one written down, differs from where the story is actually going, and you have to rework portions or sometimes a whole second half to work in the new ending. Writing freeze. No, I won't call this the dreaded writer's block, but there will be times when you either don't want to write or you can't see the next thing coming. These freezes usually take time and rest to resolve themselves. Apathy. This one I see separately from a writing freeze, and I've hit this a few times. It's where you just don't want to write. You know you have to. You know what's coming up next in the story. You know what to do. You just don't want to do it. This is when I get a kick in the pants from my writing group. Publisher shifts. I've seen this happen in both good and bad ways. One of my friends found out accidentally that her deadline and publishing date had been moved up. Ugh. And she had to rush to finish. But then it can also work in reverse where your deadline is moved back and you actually have more time. But that's not something you can bank on. Computer failure. This one scares me and makes me say, back up your work. There have been people with major issues like this that you can't plan for and you need extra time to rewrite your work. Ugh, it's a nightmare. Health. It's the worst, but we get sick, sometimes in a big way, and sometimes it's just a cold, but budgeting in sick days as a writer is something to do. Life circumstances. This is a catch-all for everything else you can't plan on. Storms that take out internet or power, a spouse losing a job which shifts your responsibilities, needing to care for a parent or a child, or any other number of life-altering circumstances that arise. Sometimes these changes are so big you couldn't have planned for them or foreseen them, but sometimes they're small interruptions that mean you need those extra banked-in days in order to make it through. No matter what circumstances you're thinking of or might add to this list, the main thing comes down to understanding your own personal capacity. It's a fluid thing that will change with altered circumstances, but at the onset of a new year, I find it super helpful to take into account my ideal number, plan out my year or even just half of my year with that in mind, and then proceed through my plan trying my best to work to that capacity. If it shifts, alter your plan to match. If I'm consistently getting 400 to 500 words per sprint, I'll know that my writing time is going to take longer than that hour and 15 minutes. It might take up to 3. Knowing that in advance can help me plan out my days, my weeks, and my months. And another thing to note here, I find that my capacity at the beginning of the year is much greater than my capacity in the middle of the year. And then it kind of shifts and comes back around at the end of the year, where I tend to be able to be more excited about writing in the fall. So it might be seasonal as well. If you're wondering about your capacity as a writer for word count, novels per year, or overall projects, I urge you to take some time to figure it out. If you're struggling to know what is ideal for you, feel free to reach out to me here or on Instagram at Create Explore Read. I love to chat with writers and help them hone their skills. In the next episode, I'll be talking about how to know whether you're ready to be published or not. And for those of you who are already published, whether traditional or indie, I'll be diving into topics like independently publishing and traditionally publishing as well. Thanks so much for listening, and don't forget to dream big and write boldly. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and review. If you're looking for more writing inspiration, community, craft tips, and behind-the-scenes content, consider joining the EAH Coalition on Patreon with various levels of free and paid support. You can also connect with me on Instagram at Create Explore Read and find out more about me, my books, and my design business on my website, eahcreative.com. Productivity in Prose is an EAH Creative production.